She's too old to decide for herself, my daughter-in-law said across my own dinner table. My son nodded. And that was the moment they thought they had already won. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and smiled. What neither of them knew was that before the month was over, a judge would listen to my decision, and everything they had planned would fall apart. I'm Margaret Collins, 72 years old, born and raised in Ohio. For most of my life, I believe that growing older earned you respect. Not because age makes a person wiser in every situation, but because the years teach lessons that cannot be learned any other way. I spent 48 years married to the same man. I raised a son. I paid my bills. I kept my promises. I built a life brick by brick, season after season. Yet somehow, 8 months after my husband died, the people closest to me had begun speaking about me as though I weren't even in the room. The dinner started like so many others. Sunday evening. Roast chicken in the oven. Mashed potatoes. Green beans. The same recipes my husband Robert used to love. Outside, the October wind rattled the maple trees lining my backyard. Inside, the dining room felt too large without Robert sitting at the head of the table. Even after 8 months, I still found myself glancing toward his empty chair. Some habits stay with you. Jason arrived first. My only son, 44 years old, tall like his father, successful, polite. At least he used to be. Vanessa came in behind him carrying a store-bought pie. She kissed my cheek and complimented the house. She always knew exactly what to say. That was one of the things that made her so difficult to read. We ate dinner. We talked about the weather, local news, and traffic on Interstate 71. Everything seemed normal. Then Vanessa asked a question. Have you thought any more about simplifying things? She said. I looked up from my plate. Simplifying what? The house. The finances. Your future plans. Her voice sounded casual, but something underneath it felt rehearsed. I noticed Jason avoiding eye contact. I'm doing fine, I replied. I didn't say you weren't, she answered quickly. We're just worried. Worried. That word had become very popular lately. Everyone seemed worried about me. My doctor, my neighbors, my son, my daughter-in-law. Yet strangely, nobody ever asked what I wanted. Vanessa exchanged a glance with Jason. A silent conversation passed between them. Then she leaned back in her chair and said the sentence that changed everything. She's too old to decide for herself anymore. The room became very quiet. I waited for Jason to object, to laugh, to tell her she was being ridiculous. Instead, he slowly nodded. We're only trying to help, Mom. Help. Funny how dangerous plans are often hidden behind kind words. I felt something settle deep inside me then. Not anger. Not fear. Clarity. Because in that instant, I understood something important. They weren't discussing my future. They were discussing control. And judging by the confidence in their faces, they believed I had no idea what was coming next. They were wrong. After Jason and Vanessa left that night, I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time. The dishwasher hummed softly in the background. A single lamp above the sink cast a warm circle of light across the countertop. Outside, darkness had settled over the neighborhood. The houses across the street were quiet. Most families were finishing their evenings, getting ready for work and school the next morning. I wrapped the leftover chicken in foil and placed it in the refrigerator. The motions were familiar, almost automatic. For years, cleaning up after family dinners had been one of the small routines that made a house feel like a home. Now it felt different. The silence seemed heavier. I glanced at the framed photograph sitting near the coffee maker. Robert was smiling at the camera, his arm around my shoulders. The picture had been taken during a trip to Lake Erie nearly 10 years earlier. We had rented a small cottage for a week. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place with a porch facing the water. Robert used to say those were the best vacations because they gave people time to remember what really mattered. I picked up the frame and held it for a moment. 8 months. 8 months since the funeral. 8 months since I had stood beside his grave wondering how I was supposed to navigate the rest of my life without him. The first few weeks after his passing had been a blur of casseroles, sympathy cards, and visitors. Everyone had been kind. Everyone had offered help. Then gradually they returned to their own lives. The phone rang less often. The visits became less frequent. The world moved forward while I remained stuck in a place I had never wanted to be. At first, Jason seemed determined to look after me. He stopped by twice a week. He offered to mow the lawn. He helped with a leaking gutter. I appreciated it. What mother would not? But looking back, I realized something had changed over time. The visits stopped feeling like visits. They started feeling like inspections. He began asking questions that had nothing to do with my well-being. How much was I spending each month? Had I updated my insurance policies? Did I still manage all my banking online? Did I know where every important document was stored? At the time, I told myself he was simply concerned. Now I was not so sure. Vanessa was even more subtle. She never asked direct questions. Instead, she made observations. She commented on how difficult large homes were for older people. She mentioned articles she had read about scams targeting seniors. She talked about retirement communities with fitness centers and organized activities. Every conversation sounded harmless by itself. Together, they painted a very different picture. A picture in which my independence was becoming a problem that needed solving. I carried a cup of tea into the living room and settled into Robert's old recliner. The house creaked gently around me. We had lived there for 34 years. Every room held memories. The mark on the hallway wall where Jason crashed his bicycle indoors when he was 12. The sunroom Robert built with his own hands during one particularly ambitious summer. The oak tree we planted the year Jason graduated from high school. This was not just property. It was the story of our family. Yet recently, I had noticed little things. Small changes that seemed insignificant at first. Jason had offered to organize my financial records. Vanessa had volunteered to accompany me to medical appointments. They insisted they were helping. They always called it helping. But the more I thought about that dinner conversation, the more uneasy I became. Because help usually begins with a question. Their version of help always seemed to begin with a decision that had already been made. I took a slow sip of tea and stared at the dark television screen across the room. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had been avoiding. What if their concern was not really about protecting me? What if it was about controlling what came next? The thought settled over me like a cold Ohio winter morning. And once it arrived, I could not make it leave. The following week, I began paying closer attention. Not because I wanted to spy on my own family, but because certain things no longer felt accidental. Once a person notices a pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. On Tuesday morning, I drove to the grocery store as usual. The cashier, a young woman who had worked there for years, greeted me by name. We chatted about the weather and the upcoming high school football season. Nothing remarkable. Yet as I loaded my bags into the trunk, I noticed 3 missed calls from Jason. That was unusual. He rarely called during business hours. When I returned the call, he answered immediately. His voice sounded forced, almost nervous. He asked where I had been. Not how I was. Not whether I needed anything. Just where I had been. I laughed lightly and told him I had gone grocery shopping. There was a brief pause before he said that he and Vanessa worried whenever they could not reach me. The comment stayed with me long after the conversation ended. 2 days later, another small incident occurred. I logged into my online banking account to pay a utility bill. Everything appeared normal until I noticed that someone had attempted to reset security settings earlier that week. The request had not been completed, but it had been initiated. At first I assumed it was an error. Then I remembered that Jason had recently offered to help organize my finances. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. That evening I sat at my dining room table reviewing old paperwork. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. Page after page passed beneath my hands. Insurance statements, property tax records, retirement accounts. Everything seemed in order. Yet the more I searched, the more I realized certain documents were no longer where I remembered placing them. Nothing major. Just enough to make me uncomfortable. The folder containing copies of medical directives had been moved. A list of account numbers was missing from its usual drawer. Someone had either been looking through my records, or I was becoming forgetful. Vanessa would probably prefer that I believe the second explanation. On Friday afternoon, she stopped by unexpectedly carrying coffee and pastries. She sat across from me in the sunroom and spoke with her usual pleasant smile. The conversation drifted from neighborhood news to health concerns. Then she casually mentioned memory loss. Not her own, mine. She told me about an acquaintance whose elderly mother had started forgetting appointments. She described how difficult it had been for the family. The entire story felt strangely rehearsed. As she talked, I watched her carefully. Every concern sounded compassionate. Every sentence sounded reasonable. That was what made it so unsettling. There was never anything concrete to object to. Only a growing sense that a narrative was being constructed around me. Later that night, I found myself standing in Robert's workshop behind the house. The room still smelled faintly of sawdust and machine oil. His tools hung neatly on the wall exactly where he had left them. I ran my hand along the workbench and remembered something he used to say whenever a business deal felt wrong. Pay attention to what people do when they think you are not watching. At the time, I had always assumed he was talking about contracts and negotiations. Now I wondered whether the advice applied to family as well. Because the more I observed Jason and Vanessa, the more convinced I became that something larger was happening beneath the surface. And whatever it was, they believed I would never see it coming. The answer arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was not looking for it. In fact, I almost missed it entirely. The day had been ordinary. I spent the morning paying bills, watering the plants in the sunroom, and sorting through a box of old photographs I had not touched since Robert passed away. Around 3 o'clock, I decided to search for a warranty document that I believed was stored in my desk. The document itself was unimportant. What mattered was what I found while looking for it. The file cabinet sat in the corner of my home office. Robert had bought it years ago from a local office supply store. Every drawer was labeled. Every folder had its place. We had always believed that organization prevented problems. As I flipped through folders, I noticed a manila envelope tucked behind several older records. I did not recognize it. That alone caught my attention. I opened it expecting to find insurance paperwork or tax documents. Instead, I found copies of medical evaluations. My name appeared at the top of every page. I stared at them for several seconds before the words fully registered. The evaluations discussed cognitive ability, decision-making capacity, and recommendations regarding future care. My hands became very still. I had never requested these documents. No doctor had discussed them with me. Yet there they were. Someone had gathered information about my mental fitness without ever mentioning it. I lowered myself into the chair beside the desk and continued reading. The reports themselves were incomplete. Some pages appeared to be missing. Others contained notes that referenced conversations I did not remember having. Nothing directly stated that I was incapable of managing my affairs. But the overall direction was clear. Someone was building a case. Someone wanted a paper trail. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the house felt unusually quiet. I remembered every conversation from the past several months. The questions about memory, the concerns about safety, the offers to manage finances. One by one, the pieces began fitting together. Then I found the page that changed everything. Attached to the back of the envelope was a business card. The name belonged to an attorney specializing in guardianship proceedings. I read the card twice. Then a third time. My pulse quickened. Guardianship. The word sat heavily in my mind. I knew enough to understand its meaning. If granted, it could allow someone else to make important decisions on behalf of another adult. Financial decisions, property decisions, personal decisions. Suddenly, the dinner conversation no longer seemed like casual concern. It felt like preparation. I sat there for nearly an hour, staring at the documents spread across the desk. Part of me wanted to call Jason immediately and demand an explanation. Another part wanted to confront Vanessa and ask why she had spent months treating me like a problem to be solved. But Robert had always warned against reacting before understanding the entire situation. Emotion reveals information. Patience reveals truth. So I did nothing. At least, that was what they would have believed if they had seen me that afternoon. In reality, something inside me had changed. For weeks, I had been questioning myself, wondering whether I was imagining things, wondering whether grief had made me overly suspicious. The envelope erased those doubts. I was not imagining anything. There was a plan. I simply did not know how far it had progressed. As evening approached, I carefully returned every document to its original position. I closed the drawer. I turned off the office light. Then I walked into the kitchen and began preparing dinner as though nothing had happened. If Jason and Vanessa were constructing a story about me behind closed doors, I needed to learn the ending before they realized I had discovered the first chapter. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of calling Jason, I called Thomas Reed. The name had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind ever since I found the attorney's business card in that envelope. Thomas had been Robert's attorney for more than 20 years. He was the man who handled our estate planning, our trust documents, and every major legal matter that touched our family. More importantly, he was one of the few people Robert trusted completely. When Thomas answered the phone, he recognized my voice immediately. He asked how I was doing, and unlike so many people lately, the question sounded genuine. We arranged to meet the following afternoon at his office downtown. The building sat on a quiet street lined with brick storefronts and old maple trees shedding their autumn leaves. Walking through those doors felt strangely familiar. Robert and I had visited many times over the years. Thomas greeted me warmly and led me into a private conference room. For several moments we spoke about Robert, about how much he was missed, about the projects he never got to finish. Then I placed the envelope on the table between us. The expression on Thomas's face changed the moment he saw the documents. He adjusted his glasses and carefully reviewed every page. The room remained silent except for the occasional rustle of paper. Finally, he set the documents down and folded his hands. The look in his eyes told me everything before he even spoke. He was not surprised. That realization unsettled me more than anything else. Thomas sighed quietly and leaned back in his chair. He explained that during the last few years of Robert's life, they had several conversations about the future. Robert had worried about many things. Not because he distrusted Jason, but because he understood how grief and money could sometimes change people. Thomas opened a locked drawer and removed a thick folder bearing Robert's name. My heart tightened when I saw it. Inside were notes, letters, and legal instructions prepared long before Robert became ill. Then Thomas handed me a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in Robert's familiar handwriting. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. The letter was short, simple, direct, exactly the way Robert always communicated. He wrote that if I was reading those words, circumstances had unfolded the way he feared they might. He reminded me that age did not erase wisdom. He reminded me that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. Most importantly, he instructed me to trust my own judgment above anyone else's opinion. By the time I finished reading, tears blurred the ink. Not because I felt helpless. For the first time in months, I felt the opposite. I felt seen. Thomas waited patiently before speaking again. Then he shared something that changed the entire situation. Robert had anticipated the possibility that someone might eventually question my ability to manage my affairs. As a result, several protections had already been built into our legal arrangements. Safeguards, requirements, procedures that could not easily be bypassed. Jason and Vanessa did not know about them. Very few people did. Suddenly the balance shifted. Until that moment, I believed I was reacting to events already in motion. Now I realized I had options. I had time. Most importantly, I had information they did not possess. As I left Thomas's office that afternoon, the air felt cooler and the sky seemed brighter than it had in weeks. For months, I had been wondering whether I was losing control of my own future. Now I understood something important. The people trying to write that future for me had made a dangerous mistake. They assumed I was standing alone. They had forgotten that Robert had spent nearly half a century making sure I never would be. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a different version of myself. Not stronger, not colder, simply more observant. I stopped questioning whether Jason and Vanessa had a plan and started paying attention to how that plan unfolded. The remarkable thing about people who believe they are winning is that they often become careless. Once they think the outcome is certain, they stop hiding their intentions. That was exactly what happened. Jason began calling more frequently than ever before. Sometimes twice a day. He asked whether I had remembered to take my medications. He asked whether I was sleeping well. He asked whether I had experienced any confusion recently. Every question sounded caring on the surface, yet there was something almost rehearsed about the conversations. I started keeping notes after each call. Dates, times, specific phrases. Robert had always documented important matters. Now I understood why. Facts become valuable when stories begin changing. Vanessa became even more attentive. She brought over casseroles, offered rides to appointments, and insisted on helping with household tasks I had managed perfectly well for years. One afternoon, she offered to organize my medicine cabinet. Another day, she suggested creating a shared calendar so the family could monitor my schedule. Monitor. That word caught my attention immediately. Most people coordinate schedules. They do not monitor them. Still, I smiled and thanked her. The less resistance I showed, the more comfortable she became. Thomas had advised patience. He believed that if I remained calm, they would eventually reveal exactly how far they intended to go. He was right. The breakthrough came during a family lunch at a small restaurant near downtown. We sat in a booth overlooking the street. The conversation drifted between ordinary topics until Jason mentioned a specialist he wanted me to meet. He described the doctor as someone who helped families assess cognitive health. The statement was delivered casually, almost as though he expected me to agree automatically. I nodded thoughtfully and asked a few questions. The relief that crossed his face lasted only a second, but I noticed it. Vanessa noticed it too. They exchanged a quick glance that confirmed everything. They had expected resistance. Instead, they found cooperation. From that moment forward, their confidence grew noticeably. A week later, Jason informed me that an evaluation had already been scheduled. He presented the news as though it were a favor. I responded with surprising enthusiasm, at least surprising from his perspective. I thanked him for arranging it. I told him I appreciated his concern. For a brief moment, he looked almost confused. Then he smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed obstacles were disappearing. What he did not realize was that I had already discussed the appointment with Thomas. I had already reviewed every relevant document. I had already learned exactly what protections Robert had established years earlier. Most importantly, I had stopped viewing myself as the target of someone else's plan. I was now a participant in the process. Every conversation became a source of information. Every act of kindness revealed another piece of the puzzle. One evening, after Jason and Vanessa left my house, I stood at the living room window watching their car pull away. The porch light reflected softly against the glass. In my hand was a notebook containing pages of observations, dates, comments, appointments, small details that seemed meaningless by themselves. Together, they told a story. Not a story about an elderly widow losing her independence. A story about two people who believed they understood the situation completely. The problem was that they were looking at me through the lens of their assumptions. They saw age and grief. They saw vulnerability. They saw someone who could be guided toward decisions already made on her behalf. What they failed to see was the one thing Robert had always recognized. I listened carefully. I remembered everything. And I was still making my own decisions. The evaluation was scheduled for the following Thursday morning. During the days leading up to it, Jason and Vanessa behaved like people preparing for an important event. They called more often. They checked in more frequently. They asked detailed questions about my daily routine. I answered every question politely. I thanked them for their concern. The easier I made things, the more relaxed they became. By then, I had learned something valuable. People reveal the most when they believe they have nothing left to hide. On Wednesday evening, Jason stopped by alone. That in itself was unusual. Vanessa almost always accompanied him. He stood in the kitchen while I prepared dinner, leaning against the counter with his hands in his pockets. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things. Then he mentioned the evaluation. He assured me there was nothing to worry about. He explained that many families went through similar processes. He emphasized that everyone simply wanted what was best for me. I listened carefully. There was a time when those words would have comforted me. Now they sounded rehearsed, almost memorized. Before leaving, he placed a hand on my shoulder and told me everything would work out fine. As the front door closed behind him, I stood motionless in the hallway. Everything would work out fine. The sentence echoed in my mind. Fine for whom? The next morning arrived cold and gray. Ohio skies often carry a particular kind of stillness in late autumn. The trees were nearly bare. A thin layer of frost covered the grass outside my window. I dressed carefully. Navy blue slacks. A cream-colored sweater. The pearl earrings Robert had given me on our 40th wedding anniversary. Nothing extravagant. Just myself. When Jason arrived to drive me to the appointment, he seemed almost cheerful. Vanessa sat in the passenger seat. She greeted me warmly and complimented my appearance. During the drive, they spoke about holiday plans and family gatherings. It felt strangely artificial, like actors discussing the weather while waiting for the curtain to rise. The evaluation took place in a professional office building on the edge of town. The waiting room was quiet. Soft music played through hidden speakers. A receptionist greeted us and handed me several forms. I noticed Jason watching carefully as I completed them. Every answer, every signature, every detail. Eventually, a specialist invited me into a private office. Jason immediately started to stand. The doctor smiled politely and explained that the meeting would take place one-on-one. For the first time that morning, I saw genuine uncertainty cross his face. The door closed behind me. The evaluation lasted nearly 2 hours. We discussed finances, current events, personal history, family relationships, and countless other topics. The questions became increasingly detailed. Dates, names, decisions, memories. I answered calmly. Sometimes I even smiled. The truth was that I had spent weeks preparing without ever realizing it. Every note I had taken, every document I had reviewed, every conversation I had carefully observed had sharpened my focus. When the evaluation ended, the doctor thanked me for my time and escorted me back to the waiting area. Jason immediately looked up. Vanessa set aside her phone. Both searched my face for clues. I offered none. We drove home in near silence. They expected anxiety. They expected uncertainty. Instead, I sat comfortably beside the window watching Ohio farmland roll past beneath the pale afternoon sun. As we pulled into my driveway, I noticed Vanessa glance toward Jason. Neither of them spoke, but something had changed. For the first time since this entire situation began, they did not look confident. And deep inside, I had a feeling they were beginning to realize that the story they planned to tell about me was no longer matching the facts. 3 days later, the hearing was scheduled. The notice arrived by mail, though by then Thomas had already informed me of the date. I remember standing at the kitchen counter reading the official document while sunlight streamed through the window above the sink. The paper felt heavier than it should have, not because I feared the outcome, but because I finally understood how much had been happening behind my back. The hearing would determine whether further guardianship proceedings should continue. For months, Jason and Vanessa had quietly moved pieces across the board. Now everything was moving into the open. The evening before the hearing, Thomas invited me to his office. We reviewed every document one final time. The evaluation report had arrived. The conclusions were clear. I was fully capable of managing my finances, property, and personal affairs. There were no concerns regarding my decision-making abilities. No recommendations for outside control. No indication that I required assistance beyond what any independent adult might occasionally request. Thomas placed the report beside the notebook I had kept over the previous weeks. My notes documented conversations, dates, suggestions, appointments, and repeated attempts to portray me as increasingly dependent. Separately, each incident seemed harmless. Together, they painted a very different picture. Before I left, Thomas opened the folder containing Robert's instructions. Inside was something I had not yet seen. A recorded statement Robert had prepared years earlier as part of our estate planning process. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was simply Robert speaking in the calm, steady voice I had known for nearly 5 decades. In the recording, he explained that independence mattered deeply to both of us. He stated clearly that any future concerns about my competency should be evaluated using objective evidence, not assumptions based on age. Listening to his voice again stopped me cold. For a moment, I forgot the hearing. I forgot the documents. I simply sat there listening to my husband. The next morning arrived bright and unusually warm for late autumn. The courthouse stood downtown among several older government buildings. Its stone steps were worn smooth from decades of use. Jason and Vanessa were already there when I arrived with Thomas. They greeted me politely, almost too politely. Jason smiled and asked how I was feeling. Vanessa told me everything would be fine. Once again, I noticed the certainty in their voices. They still believed events were moving in their direction. Inside the hearing room, everyone took their seats. The atmosphere was formal but quiet. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, just documents, testimony, and facts. The evaluation report was introduced early. I watched Jason's expression change as the findings were read. The confidence disappeared first. Then the certainty. Vanessa remained perfectly still, but she stopped taking notes. The report alone created a problem for them. Then Thomas introduced the evidence we had prepared. My records, my notes, the timeline of events. Finally, he requested permission to present Robert's recorded statement. The room became silent as Robert's voice filled the space. For the first time since this process began, nobody was discussing me as though I were absent. Nobody was speaking for me. Nobody was deciding what my future should look like. Instead, the facts were speaking for themselves. And as I watched Jason staring down at the table, I realized something important. The hearing was no longer about whether I could manage my own life. That question had already been answered. The real question now was why anyone had worked so hard to suggest otherwise. When the hearing ended, nobody rushed to speak. The room seemed suspended in a strange silence. Papers were gathered. Chairs shifted quietly against the floor. Outside the courthouse windows, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. I remained seated for a moment, looking down at my folded hands. For months, I had imagined what this day might feel like. I thought there would be relief, satisfaction, perhaps even anger. Instead, what I felt most was clarity. The facts had done their work. The questions had been answered. The assumptions had been exposed. There was nothing left to argue about. Jason approached me first. His face looked older than it had that morning. He opened his mouth several times before finding words. Finally, he apologized. Not dramatically, not perfectly, just quietly. He said he believed he was protecting me. He said things had moved further than he intended. I listened without interrupting. Across the room, Vanessa stood near the doorway, avoiding eye contact. For the first time since Robert died, she seemed uncertain of what role to play. The confident certainty that had followed her for months had vanished. Thomas stood nearby, giving me space to respond however I wished. I thought about everything that had happened. The conversations, the evaluations, the hidden documents, the growing effort to reduce a lifetime of experience into a question about age. Then I thought about Robert, about the letter he left behind, about the simple truth written in his familiar handwriting. Kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. I looked at Jason and told him something he clearly did not expect. I told him I was not interested in punishment. I was not interested in revenge. Carrying resentment would only allow this story to continue occupying space in my life. What I wanted was something much simpler. Boundaries, accountability, respect. Those things could not be forced by a court order. They had to be chosen. Whether he chose them was now his responsibility. A week later, I met with Thomas one final time. Together we reviewed my estate plans and updated several documents. Not because anyone had pressured me, because the decisions belonged to me. Some responsibilities were reassigned. Additional safeguards were added. Future authority was distributed in ways that prevented any single person from controlling everything. The process was calm, deliberate, and entirely my choice. When we finished, Thomas smiled and slid the final folder across the desk. The future was secure. As winter approached, life gradually returned to normal. I continued living in the house Robert and I built together. I drank coffee in the sunroom each morning. I walked through the neighborhood when the weather allowed. I volunteered at the local library twice a week. The ordinary moments felt different now, not because my circumstances had changed, but because I no longer questioned my place in my own life. One evening, shortly before Christmas, I stood by the living room window watching snow fall across the backyard. The oak tree we planted decades earlier stood strong against the cold wind. Its branches were bare, yet there was never any doubt that spring would come again. Age is often misunderstood. People speak about it as though it is a weakness, as though years somehow erase wisdom, judgment, or value. The truth is exactly the opposite. Age teaches patience. It teaches perspective. It teaches you to recognize the difference between concern and control, between help and ownership, between love and assumption. They spent months deciding what my future should be. In the end, the only opinion that truly mattered was mine. And as I turned off the living room lights and prepared for bed, I realized something that made me smile. I had never lost control of my life. I had simply been reminded why it was worth protecting.